Good evening. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, David Day, and this evening's program is going to be all about misunderstanding China's notion or concept of candor, and we'll deal with the issues of cyber espionage and the whole challenge of sovereignty relating to China's recent oil rig placement in the South China Sea, and to really flush out this conversation and to provide some unusual depth. We've got a 3-decade-old China hand with us, expert on China, Mr. Michael Sacharski. And Mike, nice to have you back with us again.
Well, hi, David. Delighted to be back as always, and looking forward to a fast hour with you.
Well, for those of you who've just joined this program, maybe the first time you've seen Mike Sacharski, if you look back in the archives, you'll see two fascinating programs that we did with Mr. Sacharski back in December of 2013, right before Christmas. And it was at that time, if you recall, Mike, we were talking about the Chinese imposition of the ADIZ there in the East China Sea. And one of the things that you pointed out was that China does things in threes. And you recall, just to refresh our
Sure.
audience a little bit, what those three things were that we talked about for the benefit of those who haven't seen those programs.
Yeah, what we talked about is that China does things in threes, and in this particular case, politically, militarily, and security, there are 3 steps to an objective. And with each step, there is an increased application of power. So the first step is a rather mild, squishy kind of application. Second step is more
kind of a hardened,
stronger application. And so what we were talking about is that the declaration of the ADIZ, East China Sea, is step number 1. In order to lead to step number 2, which is the stronger application of authority or force in the South China Sea. But those two are only means to the end, which is really the third step is the objective. So the question that we ought to be asking is, what is that third step? Because that's really where China's headed, is to that third position. And
you know, I recall from those two programs that one of the things that at that time you were predicting was a hardening of the ADIZ concept, but not necessarily in the East China Sea, that it may be in the South China Sea.
Correct.
And it turns out, interestingly, that I think because of your expertise and long experience in China, that you called that one exactly right, because that's precisely what China has done with this moving this oil rig into the South China Sea. And you know, we have a picture of it here, and this has caused all kinds of explosion in terms of Vietnamese public opinion, riots, burning of Chinese factories in Vietnam. And one of the things that has been really dramatic has been the ramming of Vietnamese naval vessels by Chinese naval vessels. They actually crashed into these ships, and then they used water cannons on them. You know, just in an effort to maintain a security zone around this oil rig. And I wonder if, you know, we can take and we'll move from this oil rig example, and maybe it's important for our audience that we kind of position this, why this occurred and where it is in the South China Sea. And you have some thoughts on the implications of the positioning of that oil rig, why it created the friction that it did.
Well, of course, it's within China's self-proclaimed 9-dash area of sovereignty and national interest that extends into the South China Sea. It's 120 miles off the coast of Vietnam, and so it's considered to be within Vietnam's economic interest zone. So Vietnam sees it as an incursion into that zone.
I think we've got a picture of that to help our audience. Let's take a look at that that picture there, and you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the point that Mike is talking about, where the Vietnamese Coast Guard reportedly says that the Chinese rammed its vessels just below the Paracel Islands there off the coast of Vietnam. And to make that really come alive for you, the blue line that's in that picture, ladies and gentlemen, what's important is that is the exclusive economic zone claimed by Vietnam. And so you can see that that oil rig placement is inside that zone right off the coast of Vietnam there. And I suppose, you know, just to help the audience visualize this a little bit more, Mike, let's take a look at visual number 5 here. And that one, ladies and gentlemen, you can see the yellow line again is the exclusive economic zone claimed by Vietnam, and the red line is the outline of the so-called 9-dash line claimed by China. So their claims areas overlap there.
And the other thing you see is that this is not a large, the South China Sea is not a large, wide sea. And it's actually a small, compact area, and the countries that ring the South China Sea have been traditional rivals of one another. And I think here, maybe in the United States, we tend to understand or underestimate the historical action or the historical legacies of this region, where there's been conflict historically, going back centuries, between the countries and territories that ring the South China Sea. So we're sort of, to some extent, in the modern round. If you think of this as a 15-round heavyweight fight, we're probably up around round 10 or 11 in the overall history of this area.
Okay, let's take and move to a topic, Mike, that cyber espionage, something that seems on its surface totally unrelated to this oil rig, and we'll see if there's a linkage between the two of them. But in terms of the whole area of cyber espionage, one of the things that's recently occurred here is this indictment, and maybe you could help our audience with the indictment of Chinese officials and what that's all about.
Well, a few days ago, Attorney General Holder of the U.S. Department of Justice announced that 5 PLA soldiers are accused by the Justice Department of carrying out cyber espionage against U.S. companies and industry, and that they had issued a wanted list of these 5, and so presumably the Justice Department thinks that these 5 will either turn themselves in, or some at some point may be apprehended, because that's usually what happens after the Justice Department issues something like this. The expectation is that there'll be some apprehension. Of course, that's not going to happen.
I mean, it's a bizarre indictment because the United States has no extradition treaty with China, and so
well, I think
why would you do this?
Yeah, well, I think what undermines it also, of course, is the fact that we conduct cyber espionage around the world, which has been well documented. And we are hacking each other. In fact, I think there are those, David, that would suggest there's already a degree of quote-unquote war between the U.S. and China being fought silently on the cyber level, rather than the shooting level of a South China Sea, and that the back and forth cyber activity between the two countries is really quite intense, and I think it's been documented that it's with more frequency and volume and intensity between the two than ever before.
Well, one of the things that has also occurred in the last few days is that Beijing has announced that it's either blocking or not going to permit the use of Microsoft 8 on its computers because they are concerned, as I understand it, about the NSA Snowden burying something
well, they are, and I think that's
software.
And that's a counter stroke to our similar banning of Huawei telecommunications equipment from being sold in the U.S. for precisely the same reason, that we suspect that China has embedded access points in the Huawei hardware, software, and so it's kind of tit for tat, I think, with Microsoft 8 and Huawei.
Well, Mike, so far in this program, we've talked about a number of things that have recently happened. In this media business, we call those the news anchors. There's the China's placement of the oil rig in the South China Sea within Vietnam's claimed exclusive economic zone. We've got this whole cyber espionage indictment of Chinese officials, and some response from China or retaliation is about to occur. And maybe the Microsoft, the Huawei situation. And they all, on the surface, they seem unrelated to each other. There's no common thread that goes through. And I'm just wondering if there might be a thread or some cultural clash or misunderstanding between the two countries that is actually what's going on here, that people don't see, our policymakers in Washington don't see or don't understand.
I think, as I've said before, this issue is like a big plate of Chinese noodles, and you pull the end of one noodle and you don't know what other end of another noodle is going to move until you actually start pulling. And but there are some fundamental noodles here to take a look at. One is that China is very clear that in their view, the day of America setting standards for the world, in China's view, is over. And that if there are going to be, and there will be new standards and should be new standards, but those standards should be set at least bilaterally by China and the U.S., and perhaps someday China as a leading group to set world standards, whether that standard is the CDMA wireless technology standard or food standards or any other number of standards. And one way to discredit the existing standards is to challenge them, ignore them, and create disrespect toward those standards. So part of what we're seeing is a pushback to fight against this, what they consider to be American domination of standards, by ignoring or challenging our standards. And if those challenges are not met, then the erosion of that standard begins. So that's one issue that's at play.
Okay.
The other issue, of course, you have the historical perspective. Before I came over here, I tried to figure this out before I came over here, and I didn't have time. But China has been a leading country for some 5,000 years almost. And 150 years of that 5,000, they have been exploited. Well, I was on the way over here, I was trying to figure out what is the percentage of 150 to 5,000, because the Chinese perspective...
It's not a lot.
The Chinese perspective is that 150 years, whether it's percentage-wise or what, is just a blip on the overall history and development of their culture. And so they really do, and they did suffer during the 19th century and into the early 20th century in ways that we have never suffered. And so they do have legitimate, well, I say legitimate, in their mind, very legitimate grievances. And if we had had the same experience during that time as a nation that China had, we probably would have a similar view about redressing some of the grievances coming out of those experiences.
Well, I'll tell you what, I want to explore this more with you when we come back after the break, and maybe we can get into some additional cultural clashes and miscues and what the relationship is between these news events that we've been talking about here. Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching ThinkTech Asia, and we're talking about misunderstanding China's candor, cyber espionage, and oil rig sovereignty all mixed together in this giant plate of Chinese noodles that our China expert Mike Sacharski has been talking about. We'll see you on the other side of the break. Stay with us.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Amashta, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And urban transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and our program today is all about misunderstanding China's notions or concept of the English term candor. And that brings us to some of our current issues having to do with cyber espionage and sovereignty, China's claims for sovereignty relating to its placement of an oil rig in the South China Sea, and a number of other issues. And to help us with this discussion, we are very fortunate to have with us in the studio with us a three-decade-young China hand, Mr. Michael Sacharski. And Mike, right before the break, you were talking about redressing grievances historically. And once we move from the history side of things into the culture itself, is there some thread or clash that runs through these news events?
Well, I think there is. And the thread that runs through them is that we don't understand what they're doing, and they don't understand why we don't understand what they're doing. And basically, we're talking past each other on all of these issues. They're all related issues. But in terms of trying to get to a point of resolution on these issues, they're talking in terms that don't register with us, and we're talking in terms that don't register with them. And so the condition continues to percolate. So
what you're saying is we've got an inability to communicate in a brutally honest fashion as between Washington and Beijing.
Yeah, the last time I checked, which was about a year or so ago, there are 106 official channels for communication between China and the United States.
Okay.
And with 106 official channels, we still have this situation of talking past each other. So, so structurally, an attempt has been made with red phones and whatever other kind of...
Or like this visual control room number 2. You know, the meetings between President Obama and Premier Xi.
Right.
The shirt sleeve summit.
Right.
Are you saying that all of that was kind of a eyewash? They're still talking past each other?
Absolutely. And those, you know, there's the old, and I've mentioned this many times, the old architectural axiom that form follows function. And so 106 formal channels, shirt sleeve, 2-day buddies hanging out in California, these are the form, not the function. And what we need to address is we need to address the function. What really goes on? I mean, what should be the substance of the communication, not necessarily the form of it. The form
is just
will take care of
superficial.
itself. Exactly. And so we're more concerned, we, and I'm including both the Chinese and the U.S. on this, we're very, and I don't know if it's driven because of the media world that we live in, and the instant communications that we now have, but there seems to be more emphasis on the form rather than the function, or the idea that form somehow will lead to function.
Mike, let me put up a definition of an English word for you here. And this is the English word candor. And what you're saying, I believe, is that Washington and Beijing, they've got this 106 channels?
Right.
And so they despite having all these channels, they're not able to be forthright with each other. Right. Not able to be open, not able to be honest. I mean, am I exaggerating?
No, and what you're bringing up is illustrated in a New York Times article of April 6th of this year, in which the headline is, U.S. tries candor to assure China on cyber attacks. And the gist of the article is that we, in an attempt to show that we're serious, had a presentation to the Chinese military about our cyber attack, both offense and defensive capabilities, with the expectation that they would give a similar kind of presentation to the U.S. side. The Chinese have not. And so there's the feeling on the U.S. side, well, we showed you ours, but you won't show us yours. And so the U.S., I think, feels that they have been open and spoken with candor, but the Chinese have not. But that's part of the problem, because how candor is managed on either side can be different from what your expectation is.
Well, you know, but the point that you're raising, we've seen this. I mean, this disclosure of the U.S. offensive and defensive cyber capabilities by going like this. I show you mine now. Of course, you'll show me yours because I've showed you mine. That's kind of a second grade schoolyard play by kids in the U.S.
But where that comes from, David, is we have made transparency. If you substitute the word, let's say, transparency for candor, we have made candor or transparency a virtue in America, and we believe that it's virtuous behavior to be transparent. And we insist on transparency in a lot of things now today in America that we never insisted on transparency before. Transparency in China is not candor. Transparency is not a virtue in China. There is a candor. I was going to say candor is not a virtue, but candor is a virtue in China under the right conditions. But transparency is not a virtue. What's a virtue in China is confidentiality, or keeping things private. You could carry it further and say secret. That's a virtue. So you've got the virtue of transparency on one side, you've got the virtue of keeping things private, quiet, and secret on the other side. And they're not meeting.
Which is to say that the notion in terms of cybersecurity, that if I show you mine, you'll show me yours, is absolutely ridiculous.
That's an American expectation.
I understand, but it's an American expectation.
Only.
It's
not a Chinese expectation.
But it's a ridiculous expectation if you understand the Chinese culture on the other side. In other words, you're just going to be giving away without getting anything in return.
You know, I had a Chinese official some years ago. He characterized national groups for me, and he wasn't politically correct by any means. But he said, you know, the Anglo-Saxons, the British, and the Germans, he said they're very efficient. They're very good at what they do, science and technology and so on, but they're so doggone arrogant, you know, you can't live with them. The Romance countries, and he was talking particularly about France and Italy, he said, you know, they've got a lot of style and they talk a lot, but they do nothing. The Eastern European, the Slavic countries, not very bright, but they're loyal, they show up. And the Americans, the friendliest, most wonderful people in the world, but the most gullible people in the world. And I thought that he characterized pretty well, I think, the general sentiment when Chinese are looking, and I'm talking mainly about party/government people, as party government people view the world. So coming back to us practicing transparency as a virtue on our own and having the expectancy that they would reciprocate when they aren't, it's a perfect example of that gullibility that that official was describing to me. Very nice people, very kind and so forth, but gullible.
On this point having to do with gullibility, and we'll get back to candor in a minute.
Sure.
I want to share with you that I have had conversation with very, very senior, lots of gold braid on the shoulder bar, naval military officers here in Hawaii, that their inclusion of the Chinese military and Navy in exercises and visits on U.S. ships was to set an example and build a relationship, and they felt that by being, these are the exact words, by being transparent, that they would get reciprocity coming from the Chinese, which has never happened. I'm mindful of this visit that some senior Army officers from Hawaii escorted a Chinese general to, I guess it was in Fort Leavenworth, or one of the other military bases in the Midwest or Texas, and the Chinese general got all upset because he was demanding to see some kind of Army operations manual, and it wasn't handed over immediately. I guess because he expected the gullibility and transparency in the American culture, just to, you know, he could ask for this important operations manual and get it.
Mm-hmm. And you know, we kind of set or reinforced that expectation in the 1980s and 90s. I saw it myself and in business, and I think on the security side, and that is that to win business in China, or in part because we didn't think the Chinese were capable of doing much with it, we actually gave a lot away to China. I'm talking about companies especially. Manuals, training programs were you know, at no cost, and confidential information about network operations centers, for example, how they work, the principles and so forth. All of that was given away, and I think there was a feeling that China's so far behind, they're not going to catch up, because by the time they catch up to this, we will have already gone on to something else. And of course they did. And now they're running next to us. And I think it reinforced this gullibility thing, gullibility sense, because we gave so much away, as I said, to win business, or to, with the thought that it would have no consequence.
So this is the whole concept, the business concept of you do a joint venture with us, and for so many years, and then there'll be a technology transfer, and many American companies said, hey, that's no problem, you can't do anything with it anyway, we'll be happy to give you our technology, and then they found themselves in creating incredible competitors.
Yeah, and as I say, reinforce this nice but gullible sense.
Well, you know, it reminds me of the situation involving the comments made, I guess it was during the late 1930s, by American military strategists that the Japanese were no threat whatsoever because they couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, they couldn't see at night, they wore these thick glasses, and you take those kinds of racist, arrogant, colonial mentality comments, and if you lay them over onto the security side, you hear people saying that, well, yeah, China's got its own aircraft carrier, but they can't run air operations off of it yet, and they're 10 years behind Thailand, who's been running air operations for 10 years, or 15 years behind India, been running air operations, without thinking. Look at Chinese space exploration, how fast they're able to leapfrog technology. I mean, it's the same exact situation that you're talking about in business.
I think in the early days, 1980s in China, I think in the early days there were a few young military attachés that sort of got it, or they understood what could happen. But I think by and large, on both the commercial side and the security side, there were a lot of people who had an attitude that China would not be capable of doing these things, and so therefore it wasn't until thinking back now, I think it became apparent to more people about 10 years ago as to what China was beginning to accomplish.
Let me go back, Mike, so I want to get back to candor in a second here, but I want you to look at one other visual here. We've seen it before in this program, and if we could go to the South China Sea claims map again, that's number 5 control room. If we could look at that one more time. The shaded area in that map, the light orange, Mike, that is the area within China's 9-dash line. And as you look at that map, you look at and mindful of your comments about how small the South China Sea is, that claim comes from an old Ming Dynasty map, and then I guess it was combined with some claims made by the Kuomintang in 1947 about the South China Sea, this 9-dash line area. And when I look at this and I'm listening to you talking about American gullibility, it seems to me that China has asserted a claim that in the early days, the U.S. never believed they could enforce the claim, and so, what's the big deal here, and just kind of ignore it or brush it aside? I mean, what's your view of this?
No, I think that's true. There was no Navy. I mean, China had no Navy, really, to enforce the claim. So I think to that extent, that was justified. But I think what was missed was China's ability to learn and accomplish at a rate much greater than anybody anticipated. Without going into too many details, a very good friend of mine was a major, when I say major, a significant general officer for the South China Sea. This was in the 1980s. He actually
you mean for China?
For China.
Operating in the South China Sea.
Yeah, actually he had retired a year earlier. And he ran the air wing off of Hainan. And the capabilities at that time were mainly to try and create some show, but really they did not have the capabilities at that time. But again, the underestimation of how fast they could adapt and how fast they could proceed, and part of that acceleration was that during the 1980s, some of our high-tech companies exported with approval, this was not under the table, but exported to China modern avionics and modern over-the-horizon radars, navigation and so forth, that went into these old F-8s, the old fighter they initially went into that. It was like putting the latest electronics into an old Model T. But they learned from that experience in the 1980s, and then all of their military research centers and the whole galaxy of industry that the PLA has, they went on and developed capabilities from that. So are their capabilities equal to the U.S. today? I don't think so. That's my own unprofessional opinion. I'm not a professional military person. But the gap, the point is the acceleration, the rate of acceleration is now much faster than it was before. And I think people underestimated how fast that acceleration could be.
And that acceleration has allowed, as you predicted in one of our earlier shows, a hardening of the Chinese position on the South China Sea, as evidenced by the oil rig.
Now, where they have made progress that is very much at our level is on the cyber side. Okay, we've been talking about hardware.
You know what? Hold that, because we're going to go to a break here, and
Okay.
we'll pick up about on the cyber side and get back to the whole issue of candor when we come back after the break. And ladies and gentlemen, you have been watching and are watching Misunderstanding China's Candor, and we're talking about cyber espionage and oil rig sovereignty and a number of related issues which are absolutely fascinating with our China expert here, 3 decades young, Mr. Michael Sacharski. We've got some more exciting things to come. Stay with us.
Hi, my name is Dr. Rafi. Every week, I'm right here at ThinkTech Hawaii, 3 p.m. on Mondays. My show is Boritz's Bio Briefings. What do we do here? Well, we watch sperm swim, we see if they catch anybody, we check out the latest biosimilars, you know, the kind that, what was his name, the guy with the bicycle? I guess we forgot his name, but he was taking EPO and other human growth factors. We'll be talking about human growth factors. You want to know where to get some? Maybe I'll tell. Anyway, you can catch me, as I said, every week right here, Monday, 3 p.m., ThinkTech Hawaii, Dr. Rafi. You can also find me on Twitter, BioInfoMedical. Or you can catch me on Facebook, Dr. Rafael Boritzer. I'll be happy to converse with you. Aloha.
We're back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia, and we're talking about American misunderstanding of China's notions of candor and how it impacts the whole field of cyber espionage and the sovereignty issues of the oil rig in the South China Sea. Our guest is Mr. Michael Sacharski, a 3-decade-old or young China hand expert. And Mike, right at the break, you were talking about, we were getting back into the whole issue of the espionage and the attempt by the U.S. To use candor as a way to get China to back down on cyber attacks. This is the notion that we'll show you our offensive and defensive capabilities in cyber espionage, and then therefore you'll show me yours, won't you? And you're saying it ain't going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Let's go back to our English definition of the word candor here. And I think it's important, ladies and gentlemen, that you read this to yourself, focus on it. That's what in the American culture, you know, we think of the whole notion of candor, and a piece of that is transparency. And Mike, on the issue of transparency, you've already told us earlier in the program that transparency is a virtue in the American culture, but in the Chinese culture, it's what?
Well, it's private, keeping things private, keeping things quiet, keeping things secret. There's the principle in China that those who talk don't know and those who know don't talk. And that reflects the, this kind of virtue. We tend to do a lot of talking and expect that that is going to have an impact. But they operate from an entirely different value system than we do.
Well, let's focus in precisely on the Chinese notion or concept of candor. And so, how do they perceive that whole concept?
Candor, or 智慧 as it's called in Chinese, candor really exists most often within the clan, the family, or the clan with people that you know and you've built up a relationship, a trust relationship with.
Okay.
China is a society in which there's very clear duties and obligations and communication lines within the clan. You don't have those same duties and obligations outside the clan, even to other Chinese clans. And so you can think of China as a clan and the United States as a clan. There's no obligation of China to share or talk frankly or 智慧 to the U.S. because we're not part of their clan.
Okay, and they have different characters in the language to express different views of candor?
Well, what's interesting about Chinese and the characters is they can be definite and indefinite. And there can be some very subtle differences in maybe the way a character is written or what character you choose to use for candor or bluntness or whatever quality you're describing.
Okay, let's try this. Let's try one here. This first one here. How about help us with a pronunciation here?
Let's see, which one are you looking at? Oh, this one. 谈正相见.
Okay, and how do we slice the apple on that one?
Okay, this is a more general application of frankness. So people that are generally open, people friendly and open, and will speak not directly or with candor, but are open to sharing with you what they're thinking at a certain level.
Okay, let's try a slightly different slice of the apple here, another one here.
Okay, are you the second one here?
Second one here. What?
Oh, 碳水. And that is.
No, we're at 积水.
Oh, okay. Well, you're at 智慧, which is candor, frankness or candor, which would be actually the one of the most extreme applications, meaning that the most private or most direct conversation would be a conversation of 智慧.
Okay, and how about this third one here, which is the 碳水?
Yes. 碳水 is boldness or sort of frankness, what we might call blunt.
Okay, so what's the difference between those three versions of candor and the English version?
Well, there isn't in relativity to their own cultures, but it's how it's applied. Again, we tend to be public, we tend to be very verbal, we tend to be, going back to we were talking earlier about form follows function, and we've got 106 forms, and all of these forms tend to be note-taking, copious coverage, and so forth. There's no candor. That even when we send delegations there that try to have private conferences, there's still some record kept. Somebody's still keeping something. They know that, and of course they're keeping a record too. And so the difference is that their candor is more practiced in private, more practiced in outside the glare of lights, outside the arena of other people being around. Now, I think I shared with you before that I worked with Henry Kissinger for 4 years in China.
Right.
We worked together when I was head of GTE. And he has an amazing ability at candor. And very often we would be in meetings where it would be just Dr. Kissinger, myself, the person we were meeting with, a high official, and a translator. Sometimes the person that we were meeting with could speak English, maybe sometimes not. Or part of the conversation was in Chinese and translated part in English. But here's the point. It was very private. It was very quiet. There were no handlers before the meeting, after the meeting. It was just the two of us going to the meeting, just the two of us going away. Same thing on the other side. And so it's that kind of environment, and it's that kind of form that allows the function.
I see.
You see what I mean?
Okay, all right. You know, let's...
And so we have similarities in candor, but the way it's applied is much different from what we typically do. And one reason our government has to do that is because we have all the accountability back here for transparency.
Sure, and we have all the strokes for virtue. You know, if you're being transparent, you're virtuous in the American culture.
And I'm not saying that's wrong, and I'm not making a value judgment about whether that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the way it is, and that's the fundamental difference. And you don't build the trust to get to those private. Dr. Kissinger did not build the trust in 5 minutes or in one trip that eventually created the environment or the sense of trust that eventually led to the candor.
So let me summarize, because we're running short of time here. But what you're saying to me, what I'm hearing is that the whole notion in this concept of cyber espionage, of the U.S. using candor to somehow assure China, particularly when you have the NSA Snowden thing hanging in the background. But I'll show you mine, and therefore you'll show you yours. What you're saying is because there's no relationship, and it's not done in a very private setting at all,
right,
there's no way the Chinese are going to reciprocate in any kind of candor communication.
Sure.
That's what you're saying, right? Let me push ahead, Mike, because there's another topic I want you to help me with here. And let's go back to this oil rig for a second here. So control, and what is this oil rig moving into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone? What does this have to do with the notion of Chinese sovereignty?
Well, that's a good question. And this brings us back to how we opened this program, and that is China does things in threes. So the declaration of the ADIZ set up the then implementation of this oil derrick. What is interesting about this oil derrick placement is that the Chinese official media have come out with a very subtle, and most people would not recognize what they have said, but they claim that the derrick itself, the machinery, the platform, is actually sovereign Chinese soil. And they're not making the claim necessarily that the surface water is, or the under the sea, which is within their 9-dash map. Okay. But what they're beginning to do is they're creating a principle. They're beginning to publicize in a very small way that material things can be counted as soil, if you will, national sovereign soil, which then establishes the principle down the way that if there's a tank farm down the street here in Honolulu, or there's equipment and assets or whatever around the world.
Like Smithfield Ham as an example.
Okay, that eventually, as this principle is developed, and they develop this over a series of events, that as this principle is developed, eventually then they apply that principle with greater force every time afterwards. And so you can expect that step 3, whatever that step is going to be, and I've got notions as to what that is, will involve something to do with this idea that things, material things, can be counted as sovereign soil.
Interesting. What a fascinating discussion, and we'll talk more about this third step, where China's going, what that might mean in another show, Mike, if you're willing to come and...
Okay, well, I'd be delighted to,
We'll
David.
do that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm David Day. Please have a safe drive home. Good night.